Okay, I think we are ready to begin. We may have a few folks who are logging on, which is great. I will be admitting those folks as we get started here. Let me click a few more. All right. Well, welcome. My name is Heather Haas, and I'm president of ADVISA, and I know many of you are ADVISA clients. So we are thrilled that you are spending a bit of your morning with us. I am joined today for this webinar by Olivier Aries. So I'm going to let him introduce himself briefly, and then we will get started.
Well, thank you, Heather. Good morning. Good morning to you, Lauren, as well. Good morning, everybody. I've been working with Heather for several years now. I'm the co-founder of a consulting practice called the Thrive Collective. We work in talent optimization. I think in summary, it's fair to say that most of my career has been in management consulting. A couple of years ago at Predictive Index, and before this with a firm called A.T. Kearney. Maybe one interesting thing about me is that I started my career not at all in consulting, but in nuclear engineering. And my first job was to sell uranium to South Korea.
There's no topping that. So actually, I'm really, I feel really privileged to be hosting this with Olivier. As he mentioned, he was part of a lot of the product development at Predictive Index for many years before founding the Thrive Collective. And of course, ADVISA is a certified partner of PI. So Olivier and I have had an opportunity to collaborate in the past, and this is a great chance for us to bring some really great thinking to you around the topic of moving forward and restarting your growth engine. So no doubt we could all use a bit of a shot in the arm these days. So a few housekeeping items before we dive in. First, we have everyone muted just to reduce the background noise and keep things moving forward. I also wanted to mention that if you have a question, you can feel free to enter that in the chat box. So take a minute to kind of see where that is in case you need to put something out there. We will take time at the end of the webinar to look through, see what questions have come in. And we would also love at the end to hear from some of you. So if anybody wants to raise their hand, we will unmute you. We'd love to hear your voice. And this is just a great chance for you to get some kind of free consulting around exactly what you need and whatever your organization is dealing with. So with that, we would love to begin by getting a sense of your current situation. So we do have a poll question here that I'm going to launch. Hopefully that has popped up for you, but we're interested if in the past few months, if you have changed your goals, your strategy, or any of your operations in any of the following ways. So please take a minute, if you would, and click the response that most reflects how you have pivoted here recently. Couple more minutes. Looks like we've got about half of the folks who have weighed in. And of course, the items that you're choosing between: focused on efficiency to conserve cash, focus on sales to protect market share and revenue, launching new and different products, focusing your efforts on people and culture, or did not change significantly. So just a couple more seconds. If you haven't chosen one, it'd be great if you could. Looks like we have about 89% of participants who have voted. So I'll go ahead and close the poll here and share the results. So you can see here, we have a really nice mix. We have quite a few people who have shifted to really focusing on efficiencies, cash conservation, and protecting the bottom line. Not surprising, given what we've all been through. So that was 29%. 24% have really doubled down on sales, trying to protect market share and revenues. Also 24% focusing on people and culture. No doubt that has had a magnified importance given that many of us have gone virtual. And a handful of people have seen an opportunity to launch new and different products, and a handful have not had to change at all. So thank you for, that gives us a good sense of our starting line this morning. I'm gonna get rid of the poll here and move us to the next slide. I'm going to hand it over to Olivier, who's gonna really get us into the content and take us forward. So with that, Olivier, you should have control.
Thank you, Heather. Let me make sure that I have control here.
Let me make sure that you have mouse control. Perhaps I'm not good at coming up with how to give mouse control. Let me see, Lauren. I don't see that option here.
That's all right. If you're fine with like moving the slides forward,
absolutely.
I think that's going to be.
We can teamwork this, no problem.
We will. Well, thank you. We still need to move forward and adapt. I think that's a bit of a bold statement, but why did we write this? Especially these days where we have to go back to school and now we also have to take care of the kids in addition to everything else and their homework. I often hear people saying, I can't wait to go back to normal. And I think it's not going to happen. And there's a reason for this, which is change, especially when it's significant change, like the magnitude of which we're experimenting, tends to stick. We have those like little glue sticks here. I don't know how many people on this call are old enough to remember what it felt like to travel before 9/11. And I trust that at least half of our participants are remembering this. Well, if you remember before 9/11, when you were traveling, it was a fairly easy experience. You would show up at the airport, maybe 20 minutes before your flight. You would breeze through formalities and take a seat on your plane. And even on your plane, you could do whatever you wanted. Sometimes you could even talk to the pilots and visit the cockpit. And then 9/11 happened, and then the world changed. Security became very stringent, and the traveling experience has never been the same since then. But if you remember at the time, what we were thinking was, we can't wait for that threat to be over and go back to normal. Well, guess what? We never did. And now travel is the experience that we know, which is not always very pleasant. And that's the case in many other areas. In fact, if you look at China these days, which experienced the COVID crisis before the US, and in many respects has gone out of it earlier than us, you see that there's been durable change in consumer behavior, in particular, the move to kind of digital purchases and other things. So what we can expect is that some of what we're seeing now is going to stick. And therefore, we have to probably adapt to what it is. The second reason why we should move forward is that there's actually benefits to adapting. Bold moves set you apart. And Heather, if you're willing to move to the next slide, there's been
Actually, Olivier, I think I was successful giving you remote control. So I think you're good to go.
Let's see.
Yep.
Here we go.
All right.
And I see there's 2 more people in the waiting room as well. Hopefully you can take them in. So there's been ample research that shows, in particular based on the financial crisis a few years ago, that there are benefits to adapt quickly, recognize the magnitude of what's happening, and take action on it. This slide comes from Bain, but you can find similar analysis from McKinsey and others. And what you see is the staggering difference in performance for organizations who either prepared early for the impending crisis or acknowledged the recession and the crisis on a timely basis and started to change their model, take advantage of opportunities. You're going to reap the benefits down the road if you agree to embrace what is the new normal. In fact, one, still trying to move the slides here. Here we go, sorry. Trying to go backwards here. Let's see. Yeah. Airbnb is a fantastic example of thriving in the crisis. Most people don't remember that Airbnb was actually created in the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And not only Airbnb was the product of the crisis, but it was developed to meet the needs created by the crisis. Airbnb was created to offer an alternative to people who couldn't afford, luxury hotels when they were traveling, and in particular millennials who had been, impacted by the crisis, many of them losing their jobs in services. So Airbnb is a perfect example of how you can find opportunities in crisis. Now, I hear you say, Airbnb, $25 billion unicorn, feels very far from my world. Well, even companies here around us are able to adapt faster maybe than others to the crisis. And I'll probably let Heather give us a couple of examples, I think, among ADVISA's clients who've successfully pivoted in the crisis over the past couple of weeks and months.
Yeah, thanks, Olivier. It's been really powerful to watch, actually. As many of you know, we work with clients across all industries. So everything from healthcare to technology, manufacturing, distribution, and everything in between. So we've had a really neat bird's eye view watching how our different client companies have responded. So I wanted to highlight a few of these because I think it's actually really inspiring and very germane to this topic of how do we innovate in the midst of crisis. But we work with an auto dealership here in the Midwest who has pivoted to, instead of people coming onto the lot and getting in cars and doing test drives and et cetera, they've moved to a model where they do personal car showings. They bring the car to your home. They've invested in delivery and pickup versus on the lot sales and service. So that's gone so well for them, in fact, that they intend to carry on with that as a competitive advantage, even after things sort of perhaps go back to an environment where people are back on the lot. We also work with a creative production company in Michigan. And they have a lot of, sewing machines, banner machines, production machines. They've really taken and made a shift that instead of making banners only, they've shifted to making hospital gowns and also masks. So that's a great example of being able to repurpose the investment in capital equipment and very quickly mobilize to meet a need and continue to drive revenue. We also work with a really incredible nonprofit here in Indianapolis that's focused on children's well-being. And it may not have occurred to you, but the being COVID positive, if you're a foster child and within the foster system, sets off an array of really dire and special needs for that group of people. So this nonprofit actually was able to mobilize and create a center just for those COVID positive children so that they could receive the medical services, the care and the support that they need when their families obviously couldn't care for them and didn't want to have other people be infected. We also work with a water bottling plant that was all set this year to expand their business and pursue a new strategy into the bubbly water products, which have become really popular. But they abandoned those plans and instead decided to really hyper invest in being able to just produce more of their standard water bottles, which everybody was certainly in greater need during this time. And then finally, we work with a huge global t-shirt and underwear manufacturer, and they just very quickly added masks to the product line. So some of these shifts and changes have added dramatic revenue to these companies' bottom lines and have also sort of pushed them or accelerated their entry into some markets that they might not have otherwise done. So it's potentially things that may have been on the back burner. So I wanted to just share some of these to kind of paint the picture of how we've seen real companies take some swift action even here in the last few months.
Thank you, Heather. What is interesting is to see how companies have taken advantage of those opportunities that might not have sounded like opportunities in the first place. This side is what I call the list from hell. It's a list of disruption factors that McKinsey put together, I think in May or June. You know, all the factors that are driving change in the crisis. What is interesting is that nearly all of them can represent threats or opportunities, depending on how you sort of look at them. I'll give you an example. The number one, protectionism and localized supply chain, which sounds like something you would hear only about on CNN. Well, it's a very local. It's a matter that touches many companies around us. Give you one example. I'm here this morning in Boston. In the town next door, Watertown, there's a small, medium-sized company manufacturing high-end bicycles called Sept. If some of you are riders, there might be a Sept in your garage, well-known brand in that community. Well, as you probably know, the demand for bicycles exploded in the crisis. People need to go outside. Now, they couldn't produce bicycles. Why? Because many of their components come from Asia, and it just takes one component that is stuck somewhere on the other side of the world to not be able to ship bicycles to your customers. So Sept for a while, and I caught up with their owners last week, Sept for a while was in dire straits, not because they couldn't manufacture bicycles, but they couldn't finish bicycles despite tremendous demand. On the other side, I'm working in the other town in Belmont with a community farm who has had their best ever year because people are buying locally. So here are two examples of disrupted supply chains. One has negative impact, one has a positive impact. And in many ways, you can act on those trends in your own business and decide how you want to take them. So the discussion today is really about how you look at the opportunity side of those disruptors. I don't know, Heather, if you want to move maybe to the next slide. Yeah. So if you look at the companies who've successfully did that adaptation, they've done two things, and that's what we're talking about today. The first thing is that they've tried to protect what I call the core, which is the operations that allow them to survive so far, pay the bill, hopefully keep majority of employees employed. But they've also cautiously innovated or explored new opportunities, and they've done both at the same time. Last week, actually, there was an article from Harvard Business School on this very topic, and they call this protect and pivot, protect the core and pivot to new opportunities. And what we're going to do is essentially give you a couple of tips on how to do this simply. And I hope you're going to find this presentation boring, because I hope that you are already doing some or all of those things. And that's why at the end of the conversation, we want to sort of turn the table and ask for your own experiences. As we do this, I'd like to do some 2 minutes on some fundamental strategic concept, and maybe Heather, if you're willing to move forward. I know many of you are clients of the Predictive Index, and so you might be familiar with this very extremely simple strategic framework. You might know it under different names. Comes from an older model called the Compounding Values Framework from the 80s. Harvard Business School is using this to teach leadership and entrepreneurship and strategy. It's a very simple but powerful model. So bear with me for 1 minute. What it says is that as an organization, you normally follow one of 4 potential strategies, and sometimes a combination of those strategies. If we take them counterclockwise, starting from exploring, well, exploring is a strategy that is all about innovation. You're taking risks, gambling on the development of a brand new product and service. If you're Tesla, you're definitely pursuing an exploring strategy. cultivating strategies are strategies that are largely built on people as an asset. Companies pursuing cultivating strategies really place huge bets on their people through development, learning, nurturing, career development. They really over-index on their people as being the primary fuel for the growth. Stabilizing strategies are often used by companies who reach sort of a mature state. And stabilizing is all about scale. It's all about efficiencies, using processes and systems to build what I call the lean and mean war machine. It's all about churning out profit and margins. And then producing strategies are all about winning in the marketplace. You have this laser focus on some segments. It's all about sales. It's all about winning against the competition. You know, sometimes it's a bit of a ruthless battle, but you know, you get the results. All companies pursue one or more of those strategies. Here is why I'm going through this, and Heather, if you don't mind moving forward. In the crisis, and some of you based on the initial poll have done this, many companies have hunkered down. And so there's a strategic definition of hunkering down. It means that you've done two things. Either you've over-indexed on trying to protect your top line, and essentially you've over-indexed on producing. In that strategy, the most important person in your company becomes the head of sales. You're trying to maintain the top line. Other companies, and based on the poll, some of you have done this, have over-indexed on stabilizing. Stabilizing is all about the bottom line. Guess who is the most important person in a stabilizing strategy? It's the CFO, because the CFO is cutting costs. You know, unfortunately, you might have to let go some people because it's all about protecting the margins, all about protecting the integrity of your operations. Now, it's obvious when you look at this, what happens if you just do this? Then you don't do any more exploring and you don't do any more cultivating. That means that your people will suffer, and that means that your growth engine is going to sputter. Now, the challenge is how you do both at the same time. And Heather, if you click one more, that's what we call crisis innovation, is how you can start to look for opportunities while still protecting your core. And just to be clear, when we're talking about innovation, Heather and I here, we're not talking about transforming your organization in the next Apple. I read a lot of articles these days about how you have to become, you know, an agile organization to survive. Well, no, you don't. In fact, I would say it's dangerous to try to change your entire model in the crisis. But what you can do is adopt a slightly more balanced focus that still protects the core operations that pay the bill, and start to be more curious again about opportunities. That's really what we're talking about. That's the concept of crisis innovation, doing both. And so the way we do this is twofold. One is to focus on the cultivating side, the people side, and the other one is to focus on the exploring side. So from here, I'm going to ask you to pay attention and to, you know, tell us in a few minutes after when I'm done talking what you've done. Because what we're talking about is built on practice of actual clients we've seen doing this. Also some work with Harvard and Linda Applegate, with which I'm working at Harvard. So we're interested in how you've done those things. So Heather, if you don't mind moving forward, let's talk first about you as leaders. And we're starting with this because for you to be able to have your company start to look for opportunities again in the marketplace, it starts with you. And there's 3 simple things you can do to create the right environment to let people innovate and be creative and forward-looking again. The first thing is to know yourself. And I'll tell you in a minute why it matters. The second one is to create psychological safety in your organization. And that's a fancy word. What it really means is that you have to empower your people to speak up again. And again, we'll say a few words about this. The last thing you need to do, and you can do as a leader, is to foster agency. Again, I hate this word, but what it really means is that you have to empower your people not just to speak up, but to act again. Let's remember that in this environment these days, with the amount of anxiety and uncertainty, most people have sort of hunkered down themselves, not just companies, but people, being very cautious. This current environment is not conducive to a lot of speaking, a lot of acting. And so your role as a leader is to restart that process. Super quickly, knowing yourself, what does that really mean? There's a concept that I've liked the acronym, it's HIPPO. I don't know how many of you know about HIPPOs. HIPPO is the highest paid person in the office. And I'm gonna make that into a question and I say, are you HIPPOs yourself? The HIPPO is the leader who has a dominant voice in the organization, sometimes at the expense of other voices. It matters because if you want to recreate some innovation, if you want people to start to look for opportunities, again, it's important that every voice be heard, and your voice shouldn't be the dominant one. And it's difficult for you to probably sort of scale down for being this dominant leader. Why? Because of the next topic, which is threat rigidity. Threat rigidity is something that Heather can spend some time with you, one-on-one after this conversation to talk about. This is from a behavioral standpoint, your response to threat and anxiety and stress. I often hear that many leaders have sort of stepped up in their role to allow their organization to survive. This concept of stepping up actually is a reaction to stress. Some people react to stress by stepping up and over-indexing on leadership, on dominance, on being decisive. Some other people, as you might have seen, unfortunately, sort of falter and sort of retreat into paralysis. That's like well-known cognitive things. But what it says is that many leaders have over-indexed in the crisis by being overly decisive, by being very fast to take action. And there's a lot of positives to this. There's also some negatives because you can start to stifle communication. You can start to impinge on other people's responsibilities as you do this. So knowing yourself is to be aware of how the crisis has transformed your leadership style. And in cases where it has led you to be even more dominant in your organization, I'm inviting you to reflect on this and to consider scaling back a bit to give the stage again to more of your employees. The other thing that it's important for you to reflect on is if you decide to sort of reopen the conversation around innovation and growth, make sure that you actually say it to your organization. And as you do this, make sure that you have this sort of balanced perspective of being objective about the situation, which is in some cases is still pretty dire, but at the same time have some measured optimism. I'm sure by now you've heard 10 times about the Stockdale paradox, which is this idea that survival comes from having a very balanced perspective on things, this blend of realism and optimism. Look up Stockdale paradox if you're not familiar, and see whether that's something you can do. Give people a message of realism and optimism. In fact, there's some benefits in doing this, not just to sort of refocus your people, but from a sort of cognitive science perspective, a lot of people are still in the world of anxiety and uncertainty and fear because that's what is around us. People who are in this state of anxiety let their primal brain process their emotions, and they're largely still in the world of fight, flight, or freeze. As soon as you invite people to focus on the future, as soon as you give them a path for action or thinking, you take their cognitive activity away from the primal brain and back to the frontal cortex, which is the siege of sort of thoughtful thinking. So not only will you have your people focused on goals that are worthwhile, you're going to likely take them out of this sort of funk, which is this sort of never-ending loop of fear and anxiety and paralysis. So just by telling people that you want to refocus on the future and opportunities, you take them out of the current state and you start to engage them more in your organization. So there's a lot of benefits in having this clear, objective, optimistic mandate for change. Uh, Psychological safety. I will go really quick on this, and I will ask you a single question. When was the last time you took action on somebody else's ideas? If you want your organization to feel free to speak up with ideas, sometimes with pushback, with dissent, constructive dissent, you have to create the conditions for this to happen. It's not just saying, hey guys, I want your ideas. In fact, last week I saw one of our clients send out a memo saying, we need to do something about where we stand right now. So I want you to send me a page with like 3 bullets telling me what issues you want to tackle, how you want to tackle it, and I'm going to meet with you every 2 weeks to see what's the progress. I don't think it's psychological safety. What you need to is create the condition for people to feel that it's safe and rewarded to speak up. So we have a couple of tips to do this more in detail. But again, I'm inviting you to reflect on how much safety you've created in your organization, especially these days where as a leader, you've probably be tempted to take control of things because you think that's your role. And I would invite you to think that your role is the opposite. Your role is to let other people feel free to express themselves even more than before. That's psychological safety. And finally, agency is not just allowing people to speak up, but to act as well. And it's hard these days because every action carries risks, even more than before. So in many ways, again, I'm inviting you to reflect on how much delegation you've given to your organization in the crisis, how much trust you've placed in your people, and demonstrated that trust by giving them ownership of particular actions with which you may fully agree or maybe not quite fully agree yet. It's visible. It's important that you visibly show the trust you put in your people. And if you're willing to empower your people to act more, do this in big chunks. Don't retreat from micromanagement by still having this piecemeal approach to action. No, if you want people to feel empowered to do things, they have to own it end to end. And I know it's hard these days because, again, there's some risk associated with actions, but it's important that people feel that they have accountability for their own actions. One condition for this is that you have to also agree that sometimes things won't pan out the way everybody expects, and you have to make peace with this because your employees can't work in the fear that they're going to be sanctioned and punished if they take the freedom to act that you've given them, but actually they're going to be punished if it doesn't pan out. So again, a lot of self-examination here. Of course, Heather and I are using behavioral analytics tool like the Predictive Index. That's the time to bring back your behavioral assessment, review it again, and maybe use a coach or an outside person to help you maybe flex your behavior to start to do those 3 things. Know yourself, empower people to speak up, empower people to act. That's gonna pay dividends. So that's the part about setting the stage. And now somebody needs to perform on the stage. So that's where you retreat from the conversation and you let other people do the work. There's 3 ways to do this. The first one is to bring people together. And I'm going to tell you why it really matters. The second one is not just bringing people to bring ideas, but to act on those ideas. And there are certain ways to do this. And the last thing, of course, is talent, again and again and again, because not everybody is suited for experimentation. Not everybody in your organization is suited for change, and that's okay. So remember, we said the path forward is to protect your core and at the same time start to open up more to growth opportunities. Your job as a leader is going to be to find the people who are best suited for either one of those. Not force everybody to become a drastic change agent. It's not possible, and it would be counterproductive. So if we go in slightly more detail, and then we'll be gone. The way we do this is to essentially bring people in one or more workshop. Who you invite matters. In fact, there was an interesting article. To be honest, I don't remember where. might have been in HBR last week, about a study from the London Business School about how people spend their time in the crisis. Interesting stuff. One thing that was striking is that people are spending more time now engaging stakeholders outside of their organization. And that's what we're inviting you to do as well. So when you put people together to come up with potential ideas and innovations and new opportunities, it's important to bring people from inside your organization and outside. Inside, everybody talks about cross-functional teams. Well, that's the time to do it. Bring people from various parts of the organization, and I would challenge you to bring people from functions that you might be less familiar with. Because the reality is that in the crisis, the world has become more complex. You don't really know where the pains are. You don't really know where the opportunities are. So, don't let your sort of blind sides govern the conversation. Invite people who do stuff that you're less familiar with. Externally, it's really important to invite people around your organization, not just your own employees. One easy way to think about this is downstream your value chain, so your clients. Upstream your value chain, don't hesitate to bring your service providers or participants in your supply chain in those conversations. And then there's peers, sort of like lateral experts, your alumni, other CXOs, maybe even members of your board of advisors, maybe even board members are useful to have those people. And of course, for this to be effective, you have to follow the rules that we talked about before, which is you have to commit to not be the dominant voice in those conversations. You have to hear other voices. Yes, here. Oh, maybe one slide before that. I don't know whether, yeah. But I don't know whether you and I are trying to move the, I'm going to try to do this myself. No. Well, anyway, there's a slide before that we've skipped. I don't know whether we're going to be able to bring it back here. Yeah, this one. When we're talking about conducting workshops about innovation, I don't want to convey the idea that this is a chaotic process, sort of like free for all. Actually, it's quite the opposite. For the conversation to be productive, there's a certain discipline that we suggest you adopt. And again, ADVISA can help you facilitate those conversations if you feel that you need, this sort of third-party perspective. So there's 4 areas that we suggest you sort of be curious about. The first one is the need. Really, it's about identifying sources of pain that you can help alleviate in the world. And so you have to understand, where the pain is, who is experiencing it, and would those people be willing to pay to have their pain being alleviated? That's about the need. Then there's about the audience, and it's particularly fundamental for customers. There's this concept of fastest moving customers, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. Decided that innovation never happens at the center. Innovation is an outside-in process. And so if you want to see what different new is happening in your world, you have to look at the customers who are always I call that the pains. The customers who always have those unique questions and sort of do those like kind of weird things and require one-offs. Well, most of the time they're like really, a source of pain, but they're probably where innovation is going to happen next. So you have to pay attention not to your like biggest accounts who've been with you for 20 years, but those kind of like weird little accounts at the periphery, because they're probably the ones who are doing interesting stuff. That's what I call the fastest moving customers. Then you can think about the value. What do you stand for? Why do people buy from you? What makes you unique? Because there's probably other places in the world where that uniqueness is valuable. So you can also think from the inside out and think about what is really that you're doing that's unique. And then finally, there's delivery. Innovation and growth doesn't have to come from new products. It could be a new way of doing things. I know of a company who's doing industrial products. Their way of innovating has been to offer new financing opportunities for their clients. and leasing solutions in particular, and that allowed them to restart their growth. They haven't created new products at all, but the way they deliver their products is better now. That's innovation as well as anything else. So as we sort of close that part of the conversation, and maybe go to the next slide. If you do all those things we've talked about, which are fairly not rocket science really, they're mostly about self-reflection as a leader. There's a couple of things that you're likely to do. The first one is that you're giving yourself more opportunities to rebuild to whatever revenues and top line you've lost in the crisis. Again, we can guarantee that it's going to happen, but as you start to create experiments to test assumptions about where opportunities are, you're more likely to get on the path of growth. And we know from the earlier slides that the earlier you do this, the faster you're going to get out of the crisis. The other thing is that you're likely to make your organization more adaptable in general. And I really hope that the future is going to be better. But the reality is that if you reflect, what you did at Christmas last year, could you imagine at Christmas where we would be 8 months later, which is today? Probably not. So can we imagine what life's going to be in the next 8 months? No, we can't. So we can hope it's going to be better, but there's a chance it could be worse. So if you do the things we've talked about, you really increase the ability of your organization to survive because it's going to be naturally slightly more adaptable than it was a couple of months ago. And then the third benefit is something that Heather actually wrote a great article about, comparing how jump-starting a car and re-engaging people in your organization are sort of the same process. As we've said before, just the fact of announcing that you're now ready to reconsider opportunities for growth, that you want to take the organization out of the hankering down mode and into looking at the future, just this will pay tremendous dividend in engagement. Now suddenly you're giving people a mission, you're giving them a reason to care, you're giving them maybe an opportunity to not think about other things. And so just this will work wonders to remobilize your employees in a way that's very productive and positive. So as we finish, there's this quote, never let a good crisis go to waste, that Heather and I thought was a sort of appropriate way to finish. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard it, I thought it was a bit flippant to talk about a good crisis when there's been so much hurt coming from the COVID crisis. But then I discovered that the quote was from Winston Churchill. When he was talking about good crisis, he was talking about World War II. And he was hoping that the trauma of the war had been such that it would lead to good things. And for him, good things was in part creating the United Nations to hopefully have lasting peace in the world. So in many ways, as we're ending this part of the conversation, Heather and I are inviting you to think about the crisis just like Winston Churchill did. It's a terrible crisis, but something good can come out of it for our own organizations, but also for our communities as a whole. So this conversation in many ways is an invitation to change your mindset, to start to think productively about what good you can drive in your organization and in the world. So on this, Heather, I think we can maybe start to take questions.
Yes, thank you, Olivier. That was excellent. I find taking a moment to get above our current circumstances and think about how we might invite people to ideate and offer ideas about the future is the kind of energy that we need right now. So I would love to hear from some of you on the call right now. If Olivier, you want to give control back to me, I can unmute anyone who would may want to either ask a question or, as Olivier said earlier, we'd love to hear what you're doing, and especially if you've found a way to be innovative and identify some new and different ways of finding success.